So whenever it comes to spending money, the one organisation around the world that seems to have a great ability to waste money that other people have given to it in the form of taxes is governments. We all can think of examples of how governments have wasted money over the years. Take, for example, in America, one university received over $3 million to conduct tests on hamsters, to research, among other things, how hamsters react whenever they're injected with drugs, or even if hamsters can be trained to fight. That might seem like a story that's not true, but actually it is true. Or think of one government which held a 2-hour party that cost the taxpayer €460,000, including hiring the venue, building large platform stages for speeches, and spending €11,000 on commissioning special music for the event. Examples of government not using taxpayers' money wisely can be found everywhere. Just Google it and you will find umpteen examples from every country around the world. But just imagine if civil servants, or those who agreed to spend this money or signed off on spending the money, had to face taxpayers and give an account to a group of taxpayers for every decision that they made. I'm sure then they would be very careful on the money that they spent, on making sure they didn't waste it on vanity projects or on things that didn't benefit taxpayers. They will be very careful because they have to give account. And Jesus tells us exactly the same thing that we read of in Luke chapter 16. Because Jesus wants us to be people who use wisely what he has given us to serve him. He talks to his disciples about this in chapter 16 in the first 13 verses that Sonny read for us, after the parable of the prodigal son. Remember in the parable of the prodigal son how the father showed extravagant love to his son who had made such a mess of his life, and how he was so generous in his forgiveness and in his mercy and grace. And Jesus says that's exactly how the Lord treats those who come to him for mercy and forgiveness. He extravagantly loves them and accepts them, giving them the untold riches that make all the gold in Fort Knox look dreary and tawdry in comparison. So because believers have been given so much, we'll understand all the Lord has done for us, and then we want to respond to God's grace to us by using what he has given us to serve him. In a sense, it's our response to his grace to us. We should say, Lord, you've given me so much that's eternal. Help me to use what you've given me now to serve you. And that's in some ways what this parable is all about. Because in this parable, Jesus tells us about a rich man who had a manager working for him. Turns out that the manager wasn't very good, and word got back to the owner, the rich man, that he was wasting his resources. So when the rich man found out, he sacked the manager. He said, go and finish up what you're doing and then you're fired. Well, naturally the manager was in a bit of a pickle because he didn't know what to do. We read in verse 3, he wasn't strong enough to dig and he was ashamed to beg. So while he was still employed, he came up with this idea that we read of in verses 4 to 7. Because when he had the opportunity, he went to the customers of the rich man, the people who owed the rich man money, and he told them to settle their debts quickly. In verse 6, he owed the first one about 3,200 litres of olive oil, which is the equivalent to 3 years' wages for an ordinary worker. And the manager told him to halve the debt. Verse 7, he went to someone who owed the rich man 30 tons of wheat, which is as much money as someone would earn in a decade. So the manager, 100 tons of wheat he owed him. So the manager told him to write down his debt to 80 tons, reducing the debt by 20%. What he was doing was writing down the debts to make friends with the people who owed the rich man money, so that they would look after him whenever he lost his job. When the rich man found out what he did in verse 9, he commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. The rich man wasn't saying that the manager was right in reducing people's debts. But what he meant was that the manager had done something that was going to help him in the future. Because by reducing the debts of those who owed the rich man money, Those who had their debts reduced would surely look after the manager who had been very clever and shrewd in what he had done. And that's the point of what Jesus said in verse 8. The sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. Jesus was saying how we need to use what we have. The place that we find ourselves in life. The opportunities that the Lord has given to us to live in life, not just to enjoy ourselves, but to think of how we use what we have now to serve Him and prepare for the future. The Lord isn't asking us to give Him what we've earned by ourselves. Instead, the Lord is saying for us to give back to Him what He has already given us, and to use what He has given us to serve Him. Because what we have earned is temporary, but what the Lord gives is eternal. And He will call us for how we have used the temporary things that He has given to us. And so the big question is, are we using what the Lord has given us to serve Him? So the first thing we read is that we have to use what we have wisely. The first point, Cadell, use what we have wisely, because we've got to think of the future in verse 9. The manager who was sacked knew he had to think of his own future. So he decided to make the most of the only opportunity that he had to help himself by cutting people's bills. He was, if you like, wise by the values of this world. As Jesus said there in verse 8, he was, the people of this age are shrewd. Sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation. He was wise by the standards of this world. And Jesus wants us to follow His example of thinking about the future by being wise. Not wise by the standards of the world, but wise by the standards of His kingdom. The standards of this world say, what's good for me? But the standards of God's kingdom are different. Because they are we wanting to glorify God in all that we do? Are we wanting to build up His kingdom? Jesus defines His standards in this way. What are the two of the greatest commandments? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, mind and strength, and to love your neighbour as yourself. Those are the values, if you like, of God's kingdom that He wants us to live by. Not that we look after our own interests, but that we use our lives to love the Lord with all that He has given us. Because what we should do should be all about the Lord. And if we do love the Lord, then we should want to serve Him with all that we have. Not just our money, but our time, our talents, the spiritual gifts the Lord has given to us, our homes to welcome people. Everything we have responsibility for, we should use to serve Him. Because if we realize that life is all about the Lord, then we will want to use all that we have to serve Him. So in every day when you go to work, we need to think, how can I use my job to serve the Lord? Or when we have spare time, we think, how can I use my spare time to serve the Lord? Or when we meet someone, we know we can think, how can I use my friendship with this person to serve the Lord? But it's not just how we use our time differently when we think of the future. But we've also got to think of people differently. So often when you meet someone for the first time, a lot of people when they meet someone for the first time might ask themselves, how can I use this person for me and for what's good for me? How can I use my relationship with them or my friendship with them to further what's good for me in life? Or sometimes you might quickly decide if a person is worth talking to or not, if they're important or enough or not to talk to. And if you think they aren't, then you will ignore them. But because we live by the values of God's kingdom, Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 16, from now on therefore we regard no one according to the flesh. Even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard Him thus no longer. So Paul tells us that our first priority when we meet someone shouldn't be to think, what can that person give me? How can I use this person for what's good for me? But we should think of them differently. How can I use this opportunity I have with this person to tell them about the Lord? Or if they are a believer, to encourage them in their faith. When we think of the future, that shapes what we value, because we will want to use it to what we have to share it, what we think is important with other people. What becomes important for us to tell people is a reflection of what we think is important. So maybe you meet someone who, I don't know, blocks roads because protests on roads and slows down traffic and glues themselves at trains because they think the world is about to be destroyed, the environment's about to be ruined, and we need to stop using oil and all of these things. And so when you meet someone like that, they'll want to tell you how you need to care for the environment because that's important for them. But when we meet someone, when God's people meet someone, we should want to share the good news of who Jesus is with them. We should want to use that opportunity that we have with them to show them, teach them, and to tell them about the Lord. Because when Jesus describes the hope he has for us, because words fail to grasp how great it will be, we should really want to tell other people the good news of who Jesus is, because we realise just how great it is and how wonderful it is. When we think of the future, Jesus says in this parable, we need to remember that we won't see the results in this life. Just as the rich man the manager was doing all of these things but he didn't know how it was going to really help him in the future, but he was trying to be wise according to and be shrewd and to look after himself because he was thinking of his future. So in many ways, it's the same for us as believers. Because when we serve the Lord now, we don't really know what the Lord is going to do with how we are serving him. Because we are living by faith. We trust the Lord that taking him at his word and using what he has given us has made a difference in other people's lives. Following Jesus in this life means living by faith. Taking him at his word, living our lives, doing the things he wants us to do because we know they are what he wants us to do, because he tells us in his word, and because we believe that they are true. That's how he wants us to live. But it doesn't mean we're going to see the outcome of that in years in this life. And if we always look to the future, it can mean that there are times that we ask ourselves, is it really worth it? Especially when we look at other people living the way they want and enjoying life. It can seem a hard and difficult path to walk. Yet when we live by faith, we are waiting for the great reward to come. And living for the Lord will be well worth it. So are you living by faith and taking Jesus at his word, trusting that the rewards to come will be worth it? When we use what he has given us to think of the future, Jesus tells us in verse 9 that other people will be thankful for what we have done for them. He tells us to use our money to make friends for ourselves so that at the end of our life we will be welcomed into eternal glory. Jesus tells us that someday our money will be no use to us. At the end of our life, we leave it all behind and we don't know what's going to happen to it whenever we're gone. But while we are here on earth, we use what we have been given by the Lord to share the gospel and build up his kingdom. Because if we do and people come to a saving faith in Jesus, then he says they will welcome us into eternal dwellings. Jesus tells us in his own words in verse 9 that our money will fail. So why live for something that will be taken from us? Instead, we need to use it wisely before it is gone. And what better way to use it than to win friends for us who will welcome us into our eternal dwelling. So use what is temporary to prepare for what is eternal. Jesus tells us that when we use what we have in serving him, we don't know how the Lord's going to use that, or how the Lord is working in people's lives through how we serve him or what we say. We won't know how any act of service that the Lord has prepared for us to do will affect other people. But Jesus promises us that when we do use our money and make the most of the opportunities that the Lord has given us to serve him, then he will use that to work in people's lives, to draw people to himself so that they will come to trust the Lord and follow him. That's why serving the Lord is a challenge. But when we do, then all those who have played their part in bringing, that we have played our part in bringing to know the Lord, will welcome us into heaven. Think of it this way: when we stand before the Lord at the end of our life, and he welcomes us into eternal glory, at one side there will be all those people perhaps who we have shared the gospel with, who we have loved in the Lord's name, who we have served, people who we may have forgotten, people who we may have wondered, what did I ever do? And yet they'll be there to welcome us into eternal glory. And we look and we'll see the results of how we have served the Lord. We will have the joy of knowing that we have been wise in the choices that we have made in life, that we have done exactly what Jesus says in this parable. We have used what he has given us to win friends who, when our money will fail us, our money fails us, will welcome us into our eternal dwellings. Would you like to be welcomed into your eternal home by those whom you have used your money to befriend, and you have used the opportunities that the Lord has given you to befriend? Then do what Jesus says and use all he has given us to serve him. That brings us to the second thing. Jesus tells us that what he has given us is a test of what we really value. What we spend our money on reveals what we think is really important and valuable. So if someone's house is coming down with memorabilia from their favourite sports team or their favourite singer, they show us what they think is important. Or if someone has lots of clothes in the wardrobe and in fact needs 2 or 3 wardrobes to hold all their clothes, it shows that to them image is important. So how we use what the Lord has given us, whether we use it just for ourselves or we use it for his kingdom, is a test which reveals the answer as to whether or not we have taken serving him seriously. That's what Jesus says in verses 10 to 12. He says, if you don't use the little that he has given us faithfully, who will give you true riches? Because what we have now, whether it's a little or a lot by this world's standards, is only temporary. Those who trust him will receive much more in eternity, because the rewards for those who love the Lord and have given him are greater than we can ever imagine. That's what we read in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 10, that we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good and evil. Matthew 25, the parable of the talents, when the master came back, those 2 servants who had wisely invested and doubled their initial investment from their master received more possessions to look after and riches. So there will be rewards in heaven for those who have invested with what the Lord has given us. So shouldn't that encourage us to use what the Lord has given us? Because if we use it wisely, there is the great hope of being entrusted with riches that the Lord values, with the things that the Lord says are important. Because what so many people look for in this world doesn't last. So why try to store up treasures here on earth when we can be storing up treasures in heaven that last? So, and we're being tested to see if we can be trusted with our own riches. Jesus tells us in verse 12 that his eye is upon us all. He's examining our lives to see whether or not we are worthy of the riches he wants to give us. Just like the owner of a business who keeps an eye on his employees to see who can be trusted with more responsibility, so the Lord is watching all of us. Every day, every decision we make, if the Lord looks at us to see if we are making good choices with what he has given to us. Do you know, Jesus sums up this parable, what he's really getting at in verse 13. It comes down to this question: who do you love? Who do you love? Do we love him, or do we love money? Jesus says we can't serve both, but we must serve one. If we love the Lord, then you will use what you have for the Lord in serving Him. Not just your money, but who you are. Your personality, your character, your resources that you have, whatever they may be. You are using, if you love Him, you'll use those to make the most of the life that He has given to you. Or are you using what the Lord has given you for yourself, thinking only of what you need and not of how you can use your money or time or talents to serve the Lord? Do you know, if someone offered you an investment that guaranteed to bring back a 1,000-fold increase in your initial investment, you'd jump at the chance. But that's what Jesus tells us in this parable, except He tells us something even more. He says it's not just 1,000 times, but He says it's infinitely greater. You will receive infinitely greater than anything you have invested and used in serving the Lord. But if we love money and our possessions, we'll use them for ourselves, and we'll end up losing them and having nothing to show for them. That's not much of an investment. And yet that's the choice that Jesus gives us here. So, which investment are you making? Are you serving the King of Kings with what He has given you and getting much more in return for eternity? Or are you keeping what He has for you, having nothing to show for it at the end of your life and having nothing in eternity? Let's pray.